Hello and welcome to ChessGoblin. In this video, I will show you the most successful opening against the Sicilian defense. And this opening is not what you would expect. So we start off with e4, and our opponent decides to play the very annoying c5, initiating the Sicilian defense. We put our knight on f3, and they go knight c6. And you can play this variation when they have the knight and pawn on the c file. And if we look at all the moves from this Elite Chess database, which I set for, I took out Hyperbullet and Bullet, so it's blitz games and longer, so it's on the longer side of games, and I took out ratings of 1200 below, so it's just 1200 and above people who are playing in this database. And if we look at openings for white wins about 45 to 50% of the time. And then there's this one that stands out, winning 53% of the time. And the average rating of someone who plays this is around 1970. So this is kind of a more advanced variation. And if we look at it, it's only played 1% of the time. b4. And something that we have to know about Sicilian players, they often know their openings very well. They're very confident, quick players who play it kind of as a system. They develop their knight, their pawn, they often push this pawn, develop their bishop, and they know their openings generally very well. And the idea of b4 that I like playing, and because it's so rare, it pulls your opponent out of theory in 3 moves. Your opponent is not expecting this, and unless you've studied this opening or have looked at it in a database or someone's told you about it, it doesn't really look like it makes a lot of sense. You're just gambiting a pawn, and it doesn't look like they can really recover very easily from it. But it is actually very strong and very successful. And it's been played in the database quite a few times. This b4 opening has been played over 450,000 times. After b4, there's 2 ways that black can capture. And almost all the time, more than 80% of the time, they capture with the knight or the pawn. And if they don't capture, for example, they push another pawn, we just capture their pawn, taking one out of the center, and we are doing good here as white. And then we'll often castle king side and push these pawns in the center, having a very strong center for white. But almost all the time, your opponent is going to capture. And it doesn't really matter whether they capture with the pawn or the knight, because they'll transpire to pretty much the same position. I'll show you quickly that it transpires to the same position and then explain it in a bit. So after they capture the pawn, we put a second pawn in the center, and it will transpire to this position here. And this is if the pawn captured ours. And now if we look at it, if the knight captures our original pawn right here, then we kick the pawn right here. If the knight jumps back, then we put this pawn in the center, and we capture. This brings the second pawn out, we recapture, the queen takes it, and then we bring this knight out. And it's in the same position as earlier. So if we go back, and I'll show you one more time of what happens after the capture with their pawn, we put our d pawn in the center, and most of the time they'll capture this pawn and second with this knight, but it doesn't really matter each. And the idea of having these 2 pawns in the center is to later push this d pawn to try to kick back this knight. And with this Sicilian variations, people push their d pawns with white and black very hard in the center. And to prevent that, black has 2 moves. They either bring their d pawn to d5 to try to break up the center, or lesser advanced players will go e6. This you'll see at more advanced levels, and at all levels you'll see this. This is kind of a beginner move that some people do, is they'll go here, because it doesn't actually prevent us from kicking back the knight, because then their knight often will move here, because that's what most people do. And then we can kick back the knight, and after he comes back out, we bring our queen over to check the king, and now black has to sacrifice a piece to save the game. And because of that, e4 isn't commonly played at advanced levels. So what you'll see at a more advanced level is they go d5. And here, we trade off pawns, and 100% of the time, according to this database, black captures with their queen because nothing else is played more than 1%. So they're almost always going to capture back with the queen. And this gambit is similar to a wing gambit, but the difference is in a regular wing gambit, the knight isn't here on c6. And that's an important thing to know because later in this game, this knight is a target. We have to remember that this knight is a target. We plan to move this up to attack this knight later, and it just keeps becoming a target. We attack him again, and that knight is kind of the target that we keep attacking throughout the game. Then we attack the queen, creating more initiative, and black can en passant. And that's the strongest move in this position. And I found out players often will play the en passant even if it isn't the best move in the position, because the en passant is so rare, they just want to play it when they have the opportunity. But in this position, it is the best opportunity. It is the best move, the en passant, and then we attack the queen again. And there's two main moves that are played here, that are played an overwhelmingly amount of the time, 90% of the time. They either go move their queen back to d8, or the most common move, and the only move that a computer will say is playable, is a5. That's the only good move. Everything else is like 2.5 worse, 3 points worse, and beyond. Everything else is bad. For example, here's another move that's sometimes played. But after we block this check, we have the future idea of pushing this pawn here. And then we push this knight forward to attack a fork here, and it's just terrible for black in this position. They are really struggling, and it doesn't happen too often, but it's just terrible. Another move is over here. But after we bring our bishop here, Stockfish will want black moving their queen all the way back to the other side to a5. This is kind of where the computer wants black to put their queen anyway. Staying over there, we can later develop these knights and these bishops attacking this queen. It is very dangerous to try to keep that queen safe over on this king side of the board. If they move their queen back here, Stockfish will say it's about 2.5 to 3 points worse as black, because we're still able to attack with this pawn, trying to kick back this knight, and this knight isn't really safe on any square. So almost all the time in this position, they'll move it to the back. Then we develop our bishop, and this happens almost all the time. They try to defend with this bishop, and here we can just castle. That's the most common move, or we can go a4, building more pressure on this king. And even if they try to push here with their a-pawn, they can never really take our bishop, because then we take the rook in the corner. And then we can just like castle later in the game. Like, say after they block, we just decide to castle. And say black moves their knight up. We often like this idea with the rook forward here, because if like black captures our bishop later and black moves his knight here, this is actually a smothered mate here. There's a mate there, and they can't even take back our pawn in the center, because we can temporarily sack our queen, because after they recapture, then we get this royal fork picking up the queen. And even though we're down 2 pawns in this position, our pieces are way better developed, and this shows just how strong it is to have better developed pieces. That's a really important thing to know in chess. Development is key in this game. And for the strongest move, so after we attack their queen, the strongest move and the most common is here. And this is actually my favorite variation to play against. And here, there's 3 main moves that you can play as white. A computer will often tell you that this is the strongest move, pushing this d-pawn to try to kick this knight again. There's also this move with this bishop, trying to create a pin against the queen and protecting our knight here. But my favorite variation, and the trappiest of them all, is bishop b2, bishop b1, sacrificing the knight here. And the way I like to play this is after I attack the queen, I'm like prepared to almost pre-move this. I'm like holding this rook over to try to fake a pre-move, playing this really quickly, because then black will think I kind of pre-moved it and I blundered the knight, but I want him to capture the knight. And it is the best move for black to capture the knight, but he's kind of falling into my trap here now. And after I attack the queen has one safe square to go. That's a3. And then we attack the knight again. And the most common move that people go is back to b8. And any other option for the knight is bad too. And this is the most common. We'll go over this first. Then we go queen c2, targeting this bishop here and threatening checkmate. And that's the tactic that your opponent will see. But there's also the unseen tactic that after your opponent protects their bishop and blocks checks, right here, we trap the queen. Because now, after pushing this queen up, we're protecting this pawn, and the queen is trapped on this file, and it can't get out, and then we have the queen trapped. But say our opponent plays here, and then we don't really have this move because they can go here and protect their queen. Instead, if our opponent plays the bishop up, we develop our bishop. And they cannot capture, otherwise that leads to checkmate on the back rank. One of the most common moves that your opponent will play, and the average rating that someone plays this, is a 2100. 2100s play this move to try to protect their bishop. And they actually miss mate in one here, because the bishop no longer protects this square because we have the strong pin going with our bishop on the other square. So it's very difficult. They're completely losing once we in this position here. They can try to, and if they don't move the bishop, I've seen this many times, then we just win the bishop in the back rank right here, and then the game's over. And if our opponent decides to play knight back here, that isn't much better, and because we still bring our bishop out, and if they try to attack our bishop here, if we turn on the engine here for a second, yeah, it says we're 5 points better. And here, we want to bring out another bishop, sacrificing the bishop here, because they can't even take our bishop or we get their queen. That's actually the best move for them to just take this bishop. But say they try to they try to protect their queen here by taking this pawn. After we capture this bishop, we're drawing their king out, and then we go rook a1. Stockfish or computers will want you to capture this rook, but say they try to keep it safe. Then we bring our queen out. Moving this black king around, we can later castle, bring this rook over, and even though we're 5 points down in material, the computer says we're 30 points ahead. We have these super strong files here. We're going to later bring up this knight, bring these rooks over, and black is completely destroyed in this position. There's this other variation that after we push our d-pawn here, black can move their knight to a5, but here we attack with a squared bishop, and after they defend the check, we just trade off bishops, pulling their king out, and then we do queen c2. And we still have the idea of bishop here to try to trap the queen, and if black wants to save their queen, they can move it to d6 here. But so they can't protect their knight and their queen. We can just infiltrate our queen and say they try to protect with their knight. Then we bring the rook in. And this attack is just completely terrible for black. They are completely losing. They're pushed to the back row. We are going to win this knight, and we have a rook and a queen very close to their king. If black were to play perfectly, after we push this pawn in e4, all these other moves up to here are the best moves that black plays. If they manage to play those, which a lot of people, this position is very common up to here. But the very inhuman move is if you just leave this knight here. If you were playing this position perfectly as black, you either push e6 or you develop this knight to f6. If they move this knight, we win, and the position is great for us. If you have enjoyed this video, please hit that like button down below. It really helps. And subscribe if you have not already done before. I hope you can use this video in some of your upcoming games. I hope to see you in the next video.